Clara Vale did not beg. She counted. She counted the flour barrels along the wall. She counted the cracked panes in the front window. She counted the 11 people inside Thatcher's dry goods who suddenly found something urgent to study on the floor. And when her Uncle Abram pushed her wrist forward and set her hand inside Silas Creed's palm like a receipt being stamped paid, Clara counted one more thing. The men who looked away, every one of them, except the stranger at the door. Bitter Creek was the kind of frontier town that called cruelty by cleaner names: debt, settlement, obligation, proper arrangement. Those words sat on men's tongues like law, even when the thing being arranged had a heartbeat and a name. Clara had known the day was coming. That was the worst of it. Not the shock, but the slow walk toward it. Her father, Nathaniel Vale, had been dead 14 days. Before the dirt over his grave had settled, Abram Vale arrived at the old relay house with a black satchel, 3 folded papers, and the face of a man who had already sold the answer before asking the question. "Your father, Silas Creed, $386, Abram told her. Clara stood by the kitchen table and watched the lamp flame pull sideways in the draft. Abram spread the papers flat. 2 years of interest, penalties, storage fees, road fees. He tapped the last sheet with one finger. "Creed says he'll settle." "Settle how?" "Abram would not meet her eyes. He'll take you into his house. Work off what Nathaniel couldn't pay." There it was. Not spoken as kidnapping, not spoken as purchase, spoken like arithmetic. Clara had $19 sewn into the hem of her spare skirt, a packet of copied ledger pages hidden inside a flour sack, and winter closing the north road. Laramie was too far. A judge was farther. A horse cost more than her whole life could produce on short notice. So she did what her father had taught her to do when a wagon wheel cracked in open country. She stopped wasting strength on what could not move, and she started measuring what could. 2 weeks later, Abram walked her into Thatcher's dry goods at 9 in the morning. Creed stood beside the counter in a black wool coat, too fine for the weather and gloves he did not remove. The whole town seemed to understand its part. The dry goods clerk opened the debt book. A rancher at the back door coughed into his fist. 2 women by the ribbon drawer went silent. Abram took Clara's wrist and placed her hand in Creed's. "Debt settled," Abram said. Creed smiled, not with hunger exactly, with ownership. Clara did not pull away. She wanted him to think she had no more moves left. She wanted Abram to think that. She wanted every coward in that room to believe the story had already chosen its ending. Then the bell over the door rang. A man stepped in, carrying Winter on his shoulders. He was tall enough to be noticed, but not large enough to be theatrical. His coat was faded black wool. His boots had seen mountain work. A rolled pack sat high against his back, tied with rawhide that had been repaired more than once. His face looked as if weather had carved away anything unnecessary. His eyes went first to the exits, then to Creed's hand around Clara's, then to the debt book. He walked to the counter and set his pack down. "Mr. Thatcher," he said. The clerk swallowed. "Morning, Jonah." The stranger's voice was quiet. "What is the balance?" Creed's fingers tightened around Clara's hand. "This is no concern of yours," he said. The stranger did not look at him. "What is the balance?" The clerk looked from Creed to the stranger and chose the fear closest to him. $386, he said. 90 cents. Vale account. The stranger reached inside his coat and placed a leather pouch on the counter. Count it. Creed laughed once. You cannot buy what is already settled. Now the stranger turned. I am not buying her. He looked at the hand Creed still held. I am paying the paper. The room went so quiet the stove sounded loud. Thatcher counted the coins with hands that shook despite his best effort. When he finished, he looked up. $410. The stranger nodded. The rest is for writing the receipt correctly. Creed released Clara's hand as if it had gone hot. You think this changes anything? He asked. It changes the page, the stranger said. Then he looked at Clara for the first time fully. No pity, no claim, no shine of a man expecting gratitude. Just a question, held steady. Do you have somewhere safe to go? Clara looked at Abram. Abram looked at the biscuit tins. No, she said. The stranger nodded once. My name is Jonah Rusk. I have a cabin on Windbreak Ridge, 4 days north. I winter there. In spring I take furs down toward Laramie. If you want that road, you can ride it then. Clara studied him. And until spring? You take the small room, he said. It has a bar on the inside. You work if you choose. You leave if you can. I do not touch what is not offered. Creed's mouth tightened. This is foolish, Rusk. Jonah lifted his pack. I have made peace with that accusation. Clara looked around the room one last time. 11 people, 10 cowards, 1 man with a receipt. She had not been rescued the way stories told it. No speech, no raised gun, no grand promise. Just a debt paid and a choice placed back in her hands. That was enough. She went home, packed 1 trunk, and was back in 50 minutes. 2 wool dresses, her father's Bible, a bone-handled knife, the ledger copies in the flour sack, a tin box of dried medicines her mother had taught her to keep, $19 in a hem. When she returned, Jonah was loading salt pork, coffee, lamp oil, oats, flour, and rifle powder onto 2 mules. Where is North? Clara asked. Jonah pointed with his chin. Then he started walking. Clara took the second mule's lead rope and fell in beside him, not behind him. By noon, Bitter Creek was under the ridge. By dusk, it was only smoke behind them, and Silas Creed stood in the doorway of the Eagle House saloon, watching the road until they disappeared. Creed was a lender by trade. But men like Creed did not collect money. They collected leverage. And Clara Vale had just walked away with the only thing he could not afford to lose. His secret. The first night on the trail, Jonah made camp in a draw shielded by rock and thorn pine. Clara built the fire before he finished unsaddling the mule. He glanced once at the flame. Dry grass under split bark, damp wood lifted on a coal bed, smoke low, heat rising. A practical fire. You have traveled, he said. Some. That was all she gave him. He accepted it. They ate hard biscuits and salt pork in the dark. The cold came down clean and sharp. The valley sounds were gone. No wagon wheels, no saloon piano, no drunk shouting at a horse, just wind. Clara waited for the questions. Why had Creed wanted her? What had her father done? Was she grateful? Would she behave? Jonah asked none of them. Finally she said, You do not want to know what trouble you bought? He looked across the fire. I did not buy trouble. A pause. I paid a paper. She watched him in the firelight. Men say clean things after dirty acts all the time, Mr. Rusk. Yes, he said, they do. That answer interested her more than a denial would have. He added one piece of wood to the fire. You can decide what I am by what I keep doing, not by what I say tonight. Clara pulled the blanket around her shoulders and looked at the stars. That, she thought, was a useful standard. On the second day, the trail steepened. The mules complained with the moral certainty of church elders. Clara handled hers with quiet pressure and a level voice. By mid-morning, Jonah looked back. You know animals. My father ran the old North Fork relay before Creed took the road. Jonah stopped for a heartbeat. Creed took the road? Clara kept walking. Legally, on paper. That was all. Jonah did not push. He had a soldier's patience, though she did not yet know where he had learned it. He let facts arrive at their own pace. The pass turned icy after noon. One shelf of shale had washed loose, forcing them to unload both mules and carry supplies across by hand. Jonah reached for the flour sack. Clara took it first. That is heavier than it looks, he said. I know what flour weighs. She crossed slowly, boot by boot, breath by breath. Halfway over, the shale shifted. Her knee struck stone. The sack pitched toward the drop. Jonah was there fast, but he did not yank her upright. He braced the load and waited until she found her own balance. I've got it, she said. I can see that. That mattered. It was a small thing, but in a life measured by small warnings, small mercies had weight. They reached Windbreak Ridge near dusk on the fourth day. The cabin sat low in a pocket of pines, built from dark logs and river stone, more stubborn than pretty. A split-rail fence leaned around a small yard. Smoke stains marked the chimney. Beyond it, the mountain lifted in blue shadow. Jonah opened the door. The room inside was cold enough to bite, but solid. Stove, table, 2 chairs, shelves, cot in the main room. A second narrow room with a door. That one is yours, he said. Clara stepped inside. The bar on the inner side of the door was new. The wood around it was fresh cut. You built that before you knew me. Jonah set down a sack of oats. I built it before I went down to Bitter Creek. Why? He worked one glove off, finger by finger. Because Bitter Creek is Bitter Creek. There are men who wait to be decent until someone is watching. Jonah Rusk had built privacy for a person he had not met. Clara filed that beside the fire, the receipt, and the way he had not pulled her up on the shale. Evidence, her father used to say, is not one thing. It is the shape made by many things. The first snow came that night. By morning, the world beyond the window was white. They spent 2 days inside. Clara inventoried the food stores, separated medical supplies from tools, moved the coffee away from the lamp oil, and lined her medicine tins along half of the middle shelf. Jonah watched her reorganize his cabin without asking. Then he got up and moved 1 sack of beans to make room. That is my shelf, he said. You had 3 shelves. I did. Now you have 2.5. He looked at the tins. What is in them? Yarrow, comfrey, feverfew, calendula, willow bark, mullein. You a doctor? No. A pause. My mother knew plants. She taught me before she died. Jonah looked at the stove door instead of her face. Fever? Yes. He nodded once, as if grief could be greeted without being disturbed. My wife died of fever, he said, 7 winters back. Clara's hand stopped on the comfrey tin. What was her name? Leah. A good name. It was. Nothing more was said. Nothing more was needed. The room changed anyway. Grief recognized grief before either of them could dress it in language. When the snow cleared, they worked. Jonah split wood with his left shoulder held too stiff. Clara noticed and gave him salve without ceremony. Use it or don't. He used it. She repaired the north fence, and he found that she drove posts straighter than most hired men. He taught her how to seal the animal shed roof with pitch when the sun held long enough for it to bond. She taught him which dried root helped lung cold and which one only made tea taste like dirt. They settled into labor the way other people settled into conversation. Not tender, not easy, useful. Then, on the 9th day, the ridge reminded them that useful did not mean safe. They were checking the south trail after fresh snow when Jonah's horse screamed. A thin line of twisted wire, strung low between two scrub pines, caught the animal's front legs. The horse went down. Jonah hit the slope shoulder first and slid toward a spill of broken rock. Clara dropped her own reins and threw herself after him. Jonah caught a root with one hand, the damaged shoulder. His fingers slipped. Clara drove her knife into the frozen dirt above him and wrapped both hands around his wrist. "Hold," she said. "I am holding." "No, hold better." For one wild second the mountain had all of him. Then Clara braced one boot against a stone and leaned back with everything she had. Jonah came up over the lip hard, breathing through clenched teeth. The horse struggled behind them, caught in wire and panic. Clara went to the animal first. "Easy, easy now. Stop fighting me and I can get you loose." Her hands worked the wire from the horse's legs. Not barbed. Deliberate, set by someone who wanted a fall, not just a lame horse. A message disguised as an accident. Jonah sat in the snow, left arm useless at his side. "Shoulder?" she asked. "Out," he said. She looked at him. "Can you ride?" "I can sit on a horse." "That was not the question. It is the answer I have." They got back to the cabin slowly. Clara reset his shoulder with a strip of leather between his teeth and her knee braced against the cot. When the joint slid back into place, Jonah made no sound. That frightened her more than if he had shouted. Men who swallowed pain that completely had either learned it in war or marriage or grief. Sometimes all three. She wrapped the shoulder tight and packed the bruised skin with comfrey. "Who owns that stretch of trail?" she asked. "I do. Who knows you use it?" "Anyone who knows the ridge." "Creed knows?" Jonah's jaw worked once. "Creed knows enough." Clara washed her hands in the basin. "He sent the wire." Jonah looked at her. "You are sure?" "No," she said. "I am measuring." She went to her trunk, lifted the false bottom, and brought out the flour sack. Inside were copied ledger pages, deed records, 3 letters, a map drawn in her father's careful hand. Jonah sat up despite the pain. Clara put everything on the table. "Silas Creed did not want me for work," she said. "He wanted me where he could watch me, or where I could disappear without asking the wrong judge the right question." Jonah said nothing. She pointed to the map. "My father owned the North Fork Relay Road. That road is the only dry approach to the upper water cut. Creed lent him money for new horses at 28% monthly interest, then added penalties that were never spoken aloud. When my father defaulted, Creed took the road." She moved to the next paper. "This is the first water parcel. This is the second. This is the third. All taken through debt settlement in 4 years. Different families. Same pattern." Another page. "This is Elias Prynne, the land clerk. Creed pays him $18 a month through a livery account. Prynne gives him notice before boundary claims are posted. Jonah stared at the papers with the stillness of a man who understood maps. He is buying the water. Yes, not just the road, the valley. Clara nodded. Once he owns the water cut and the approach road, every ranch below Bitter Creek pays him to keep a crop alive. That is not lending. That is a private kingdom. The stove cracked. Jonah looked from the papers to Clara. How long have you had this? 8 months. And you stayed. I had my father sick in the next room. No horse, no money, and every man in Bitter Creek owing Creed something. So yes, I stayed. I copied. I watched. I waited. She touched the letters. My father filed once with the territorial court in Laramie. They dismissed it because he could not prove coordination. These letters prove it. They connect Creed to a land agent in Laramie before the loans were written. Jonah leaned back carefully, shoulder tight in linen. In Thatcher's store, he said slowly, you were not surrendering. No, you were calculating. Yes, that word sat between them. Calculating, not helpless, not broken, not rescued entire. Jonah looked at the receipt he had brought from Thatcher's, folded in his coat pocket. I thought I pulled you out of his hand. Clara's voice softened, but only slightly. You opened a door, I walked through it. A long silence followed. Then Jonah said, who needs to see those originals? Judge Malcolm Voss in Laramie. If he still sits the winter circuit, he does. You know him? Jonah's face closed around an old memory. I carried dispatch under him during the war when he was still a colonel. He was stern then, fair when it cost him. That kind usually stays one or the other. Clara let that settle. The pass is locked until thaw, she said. Not all of it. Jonah looked toward the eastern wall as if he could see through it to the other ridge. There is one man who can still cross. His name was Abel Stroud. He lived 9 miles east in a dugout cabin roofed with sod and lodgepole. He trapped less than people thought and saw more than anyone knew. Jonah trusted him with his life, which was a statement Clara did not take lightly. Abel arrived 2 days later after Jonah sent a 3-smoke signal from the chimney. He was in his 60s, narrow as an axe handle, with a gray beard cut blunt and eyes that looked permanently unimpressed with weather. He stepped inside, looked at Clara, looked at Jonah's bound shoulder, and said, "Trouble got company now." Jonah laid out the facts. Not drama. Facts. Creed. The debt settlements. The water parcels. The paid clerk. The wire on the trail. The need to get copies to Laramie before spring. Abel listened with both hands around a coffee cup. When Jonah finished, Abel turned to Clara. "You made copies? I can make complete ones in 2 days. Originals stay here? Yes, good. Originals do not ride in winter unless there is no other sin left." His face did not change, but his voice did. "Nathaniel Vale kept the fairest relay scale on the North Road. I used it 10 years. Never cheated a pound." Clara swallowed once. "He would be glad you remembered." "I did not forget." Abel stood. "Make your copies. Write a letter to Voss naming what is in the packet. I leave when the moon is dark. Less shine on snow." Jonah frowned. "That is a hard crossing." Abel looked at him. "So is being owned by Silas Creed. He left before dusk. For 2 days." Clara copied every page by lamplight. She wrote until her fingers cramped. Jonah kept the stove hot, brewed coffee too strong, and learned to make beans almost edible. Once, without a word, he set her own willow bark tea beside her hand. She looked up. He had already turned away. That was his kindness. never asking to be admired for being kind. On the third night, while Clara was sealing the packet in oiled cloth, riders came up the south trail. Jonah took the rifle from the wall. "Finish," he said. "I am finished. Hide the originals." "Where?" "Third floor, plank under your cot. Loose at the west end." Clara went still for half a breath. "You have many secrets in this cabin, Mr. Rusk. Only the useful kind." She hid the originals and returned as Jonah opened the door. 3 men sat their horses in the yard. One held a lantern. One had a shotgun across his lap. The third was Samuel Pike, Silas Creed's bookman, wearing city gloves that had no business in mountain weather. "Mr. Rusk," Pike called. Jonah stood in the doorway, rifle down, but present. "You are far from your ledger." Pike smiled thinly. "Mr. Creed prefers mistakes corrected before they become expensive." He looked past Jonah toward Clara. "Miss Vale may return to Bitter Creek. Mr. Creed will consider the matter private. No charge against you for interference. No trouble on the ridge." Clara stepped to Jonah's side before he could answer. "Tell Mr. Creed," she said, "that I am not a misplaced object." Pike's smile faded. "Miss Vale, no one asked you to speak." Jonah's rifle lifted by 1 inch. "She is the only person here you came to discuss." Wind moved through the yard. The lantern flame twitched. Pike chose a new mask. "You misunderstand. Mr. Creed has legal interest." "No," Clara said, "he has fear." The man with the shotgun shifted. Jonah's voice stayed even. "The next rider Creed sends without invitation walks home." Pike looked at the rifle, then at Clara, then at the cabin as if trying to count what else might be hidden there. "This will not end well," he said. "It already ended once," Clara told him, "in Thatcher's store. Your employer was just too proud to read it." The 3 men turned their horses. Clara and Jonah watched until the last lantern light vanished below the pines. Inside, Jonah barred the door. "Abel leaves sooner," he said. "Tonight," Clara answered. Abel came before dawn because he had seen the rider's tracks and understood without being told. Clara handed him the oilskin packet. "Addressed to Judge Malcolm Voss, Laramie Winter Circuit," she said. "It states coordinated land fraud, undisclosed loan terms, public clerk bribery, and witness intimidation. Tell him Nathaniel Vale's daughter is alive and ready to testify." Abel tucked the packet under his coat. "If I am not back in 10 days? Then we assume you were stopped and take the originals south ourselves." "No," Abel said. "You assume I am late. On the 12th day you worry." He looked at Jonah. "Keep your smoke regular." Jonah nodded. Abel rode out into a snow-dark morning. Waiting is a form of labor no one pays for. Clara hated it, so she worked. She split kindling. She mended harness. She checked the old wire line on the south trail with Jonah every morning. His shoulder healed enough for use, not enough for pride. She knew the difference, and so did he. On the 5th day, the cold came hard enough to turn the window frost thick as lace. They moved both cots closer to the stove without discussion. Practical, necessary, and not only practical. Neither said that part aloud. On the 7th day, no Abel. On the 9th, no Abel. On the 11th morning, Jonah saddled 2 horses. Clara came out wearing her coat. "You are not leaving me here." "I know." He handed her the reins. "If we find trouble, you take the East Fork and ride for Laramie." "And you?" "I slow whatever is behind you." She did not take the reins, Jonah. He looked at her. "The papers matter," she said. "Not me more than them." His voice was flat and immediate. "You are not evidence. You are a person." No one had said it that plainly to her in years. She took the reins then. They rode east under a white sky. 2 miles from the cabin, a horse came through the timber at a tired walk. Abel sat upright in the saddle. Snow crusted his beard. One cheek was bruised. But he was alive. He stopped in front of them and held out a sealed paper. Clara broke it with fingers that did not feel steady. Judge Malcolm Voss acknowledged receipt of the packet. The copied documents had been reviewed with the Territorial Land Office. There was sufficient cause to open a formal inquiry into Silas Creed. Elias Prynne, land clerk of Bitter Creek District, had been detained for questioning. 3 contested water deeds were placed under temporary hold, and Clara Vale was ordered to appear in Laramie before first thaw to enter testimony. Clara read the letter once, then again. The words stayed the same. The world did not. She folded the paper along its creases and looked out across the snow. Creed had been touched by law outside his own pocket. Not defeated. Not yet. But reached. And for the first time since her father bent over his ledgers by a dying lamp, Clara felt the shape of the trap change direction. Jonah watched her face. "It is open?" he asked. "It is open." Abel spat red into the snow. "Clerk talked fast?" Abel's mouth twitched. Clerks who sell paper do not always enjoy iron doors. They returned to the cabin with the letter inside Clara's coat. The next 6 weeks were not peaceful. Peace was too clean a word for winter, evidence, injury, and waiting. But they were steady. That was better. Jonah taught Clara the eastern routes. Not as a courtesy, as preparation. She learned where the snow crust broke near the creek shelf, where a horse could drink when the trough froze, where smoke could be seen, and where it disappeared against the black pines. Clara taught Jonah how to read fever before a man admitted he was sick, how to steep willow bark without ruining it, how to clean a wound without pretending pain was an insult. They spoke more at night. Not easily. Not constantly. Truthfully. Jonah told her about the war in fragments. A river crossing, a winter camp, orders given by men far from the dying. A colonel named Voss who once punished an officer for stealing blankets from wounded men. Clara told him about her father after her mother died, how he learned to braid her hair badly and kept doing it until she learned to do it herself. How he loved honest weights more than profit. How he trusted Creed because he believed terms, written on paper, had to mean what spoken words promised. One evening, Jonah asked what Nathaniel would want if he could see this. Clara did not answer quickly. The stove burned low. The wind had fallen. The whole ridge seemed to be listening. He would want the road clean, she said, not his name praised. Not revenge shouted, just the road clean enough that the next man could travel it without being robbed by paperwork. Jonah nodded. Then we clean the road. We. The word no longer startled her. It had settled into the cabin like another beam in the roof. The pass opened early in March after 4 warm days and 1 night of rain. The snowpack softened. The creek began to speak under ice. Abel rode over to watch the cabin while they rode south. The journey to Laramie took 3 days. Clara carried the originals wrapped in oilskin under her coat. Jonah rode to her left, not in front, not behind. Beside, Judge Voss received them in a courthouse office smelling of ink, damp wool, and old decisions. He was a square man in his 60s with close-cut white hair and eyes that wasted nothing. He read every original. He compared signatures. He examined the letters. Then he looked at Clara. "Miss Vale, do you understand that Mr. Creed has retained counsel and will attempt to discredit you?" "Yes. He will call you bitter. He would not be the first. He will say your father misunderstood the terms. My father kept freight accounts for 17 years without losing a load or misweighing a crate. He understood numbers." Voss looked down once, hiding the smallest approval. "He will say you were influenced by Mr. Rusk." Clara glanced at Jonah. Jonah sat still with his hat on his knee. "I was influenced by my father's ledgers," she said. "Mr. Rusk influenced my ability to reach your office alive." Voss set down the letter. "That is a useful distinction." He took her testimony for 2 hours. Dates, amounts, names, parcels, payment routes, the relay road, the water cut, the false default, Abram Vale's debt, the arrangement at Thatcher's store, the riders sent to Windbreak Ridge. Clara answered each question with the calm of a woman who had been preparing in silence, while men mistook silence for surrender. When it was over, Voss signed the entry order. "These originals are now part of territorial record," he said. "Certified copies will be made today. The contested deeds remain frozen. Prynne is cooperating. If his statement holds, Creed's water claim collapses." Clara closed her eyes for one breath. Not relief, not victory. A door unbolting. Voss's voice softened. "Your father filed a petition 22 months ago. It failed because he lacked proof of coordination. I know. This is that proof. Yes, I am sorry he did not live to bring it." Clara looked at the judge across the desk. "So am I." Outside the courthouse, Laramie moved around them in mud and horse noise and thawing street ruts. Jonah stood beside her on the steps. "The part that was yours to carry," he said. "You carried. It is not finished. No, but it is no longer buried." She watched a wagon pass, wheels cutting brown water from the road. "In spring, when this hearing pulls me back," she said, "I will come. I know. After that, I am not going to Bitter Creek. I know that, too." She turned to him. "I am going back to Windbreak Ridge." Jonah did not move, but something in his face opened with such care it almost hurt to see. "Only if it is where you want to go, it is. Not because winter trapped you there. No. Not because I paid a paper. No. Not because you have nowhere else." Clara stepped closer. "Jonah Rusk, I have been nowhere else for most of my life. Do not mistake that for not knowing where I am choosing." He looked at her then, fully, as he had in Thatcher's store. But this time there was no question between them. Only evidence. 4 days on the trail. A barred door never used. A shelf surrendered. A shoulder set. A packet carried through winter. A word repeated until it became structure. "We." Jonah offered his arm, formal and plain. Clara took it. They went home. The inquiry lasted 9 months. Silas Creed fought every page. He hired lawyers from 2 counties, produced alternate ledgers, claimed Nathaniel Vale had been careless, claimed Elias Prynne had acted alone, claimed Abram Vale had authority, claimed Clara was unstable, ungrateful, and manipulated. It did not hold. Numbers held, signatures held. Prynne talked. Abram ran and was caught in a border town with Creed's money in his coat lining. 3 families came forward with matching loan terms. The water deeds were voided. The North Fork Relay Road returned to the Vale estate by order of the territorial court. Creed was convicted on 2 counts of coordinated land fraud, 1 count of bribing a public clerk, and 1 count of coercive debt practice. He served 5 years in Laramie prison and lost nearly everything he had tried to own. Clara did not attend the sentencing. She was on Windbreak Ridge, cutting new shelves into the cabin wall. By May, the pines smelled warm again. A circuit preacher came up the North Trail. Abel Stroud arrived wearing a clean shirt that seemed to irritate him. Jonah stood in the yard near the fence Clara had helped straighten before the deep snow. Clara wore the dark blue dress from her trunk, the one she had carried out of Bitter Creek when she had no horse, no certainty, and $19 hidden in a hem. The preacher spoke the old words. Jonah spoke his carefully. Clara spoke hers without trembling. She became Clara Rusk that morning, not because a debt placed her in a man's hand, not because a receipt moved her from one owner to another, not because winter made a cage and called it shelter. She chose him, with evidence, with time, with every fact weighed and every fear allowed its place. Months later, people in Bitter Creek would say Jonah Rusk saved Clara Vale because that was the easier story. It fit in a mouth. It gave the town 1 decent man and 1 grateful woman and asked nothing harder. But Clara knew the truth. Jonah had looked when others looked away. He had paid the paper. He had opened the door. But she had walked through it carrying ledgers, medicine tins, grief, patience, and a mind no man in Bitter Creek had thought to fear until it was too late. On the ridge the wind still came hard. Winter still meant work. Loss did not vanish. The past did not become gentle just because justice found part of it. Freedom was not softness. Freedom was the right to choose the weight you carried. And Clara had chosen. She stood one evening outside the cabin as the pines moved above her, and Jonah repaired harness by the open door. And she understood at last what her father had been trying to protect all those years. Not land, not reputation, not even the road. The right to belong to your own life. Clara looked at the mountain, then at the man she had chosen beside it. And this time, when the wind moved, nothing in her had to bend.